Good morning. How are you?
Welcome. Good morning.
I do want to, first of all, thank you for allowing me to come on and be with you. And I also want to just make a slight correction. I'm a bishop with the College of Affirming Bishops, and I'm a distinguished visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival. And I'm so honored to be with you. I was just stuck in the conversation about Ignatius because being a part Pentecostal and Congregationalist, this idea of knowledge that we know deep within, regardless of what people may try to say to us, is so important of a theological framework. One of my professors actually taught us that you can call your religious experience whatever you want to. You can say you were sprinkled, baptized, immersed, filled with the Spirit. But at the end of the day, if it does not produce a quarrel with the world's injustices and a eternal discontent with injustice, particularly as it relates to how the poor are treated, then it renders that claim of spirituality terribly suspect. And I'm glad to see the spirituality on this call. I'm honored the Holy Father, Pope Francis, endorses this work. My dear friend, Jeffrey Sachs, invited me on your behalf to be a part of this work. I actually received a note a few weeks ago, and it said that they wanted me specifically to talk about children in this pandemic and why the church cannot allow, we must take on several lies. One of them is the lie of scarcity. There is no scarcity of resources. And then the distortions that we really don't know how to fix this. We've known how to fix this. Even in 1948, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was clear on what was needed. But what we seem to have a problem with is the lack of a consistent moral consciousness in our public theology and public policy. I was actually at the UN speaking to the Special Rapporteur on poverty even before COVID hit, and then since COVID came. And one of the things he said to me is, Reverend Barber, we don't have a lack of resources in the world. He began to explain what he meant by that and how much is actually available to address these issues. Secondly, he said, we don't have a lack of ideas. It's almost similar to the pandemic. My daughter is a public health PhD out of Harvard, and she said to me with others, Dad, we knew everything we needed to do to address this pandemic up front, and it would not have cost us nearly 1 million lives. In fact, one study at Columbia University said 60% of the people who died didn't even have to die if we had followed what was known. But there was a refusal at some of the highest levels to do that. And so he went on to say, so what we do have is a need for a transformational moral narrative, of a transformation of our moral narrative and our moral framework. So in light of that, I want to talk a little bit about where we were before the pandemic and where we are as it relates to children. And from my perspective of having to be, being a pastor more than 30 years in America and being engaged with the Poor People's Campaign, but then to say if this is the reality here, it is even more so in other nations, because if the nation that claims to be the wealthiest nation in the history of the world has not fully addressed these issues, then we know that there is deep trauma around the world. I want to start in the text, and something that has great exegetical importance to me and to the church, and also pulls at a deep place in our spirits when you hear it. Isaiah chapter 10 in the Message Bible says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children pray, not P-R-A-Y, but literally make women and children pray, P-R-E-Y. And the ancient prophet said, this comes about not as a matter of personal choice, but as a matter of deliberate deciding to legislate, to pass unjust law. And then, of course, in Jesus's words in the red letters of the gospel, as he was closing his earthly life in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus begins to discuss the issue of religiosity as it relates to tithing. And he says something that should disturb us all. He says, you have done all of these things, tithe, as you should have done, but you have left undone the weightier matter of the law. And the first one is justice, kindness, and faithfulness. You have left undone the weightier matter. When we look at this, and then we think about something that Dr. King said in 1967 in a writing called The Three Evils of Society, Dr. King said, again and again and again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation of the suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad. Dr. King was called everything for saying that, socialist and everything else, but what he was saying as a Christian preaching prophet was a critique of mythology, because mythology can take on a life sometimes stronger than the truth. And he said, if we believe a myth, and then that informs our moral and political action, then our moral and political actions will be also driven by a myth, and we continue to recreate the myth. Isaiah 10 and Jesus in Matthew tell us clearly, make us clearly that we cannot look away and believe in these myths that people choose to be poor, children choose to be poor, but that poverty and low wealth are results of actions, political actions, deliberate actions. And those actions and that legislation often grows out of what King called a mythology that if you just work hard and sacrifice, that everything will be all right. And anybody who's poor, adult, or child, then they are not working hard. They are not sacrificing. And that is the mythology that keeps us from addressing the public policy issues that we face before COVID. Dr. King also said that any country that puts more in war and militarism than it does in lifting up its people is headed toward spiritual death. And then finally, he said, there must be a better distribution of wealth. And he said, and maybe America must move toward democratic socialism. This is Dr. King in 1966. If he had lived and had a chance to unpack all of this, where would we be if we had really decided to address the violence that Coretta Scott King called violence, social violence? Like poverty is a form of violence. Denying people health care is a form of violence. But where we are, even now, is we face a crisis of possibility, civilization, and democracy. And even here in America, we get lost often in the debate about top lines in legislative packages, or whether we need to means test something, or whether we need to make sure that poor people are not cheating the system. These become the questions, whether or not we have enough money in a society of $21 trillion gross domestic product. And what happens is we get locked in to either the mythology, as Pope Francis has said, of trickle-down economics, or the mythology of neoliberalism, and we do not deal with the truth and how we can provide for everyone's need. And that's why the church has to be engaged in public policy through our focus in moral public theology. because we're too often caught up in the contemporary movement about whether a policy can pass in the Senate, whether it can pass in the House, how much will it cost if we do it. When Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize economist, who was an advisor to the Poor People's Campaign early on, said the real question is not what does it cost for us to do it, what does it cost for us not to do it. The reality is the greatest moral voices are poor and low wealth, both in America and around the country. And the one thing that they know is that we cannot continue in our country or in the world leaning into the denial of what's possible and the lies of scarcity. I love the way Pope Francis said it. God bless him. Today we see the world as has never been so rich, yet despite such abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow. And in these times of opulence, when it should be possible, not just to discuss poverty or to address a little bit of, but to end poverty, the Holy Father said. The powers of one-track thinking say nothing of the poor, the elderly, the migrants, the unborn, and the seriously ill. Mostly invisible, they are treated like disposable. And we in the church cannot allow people to remain invisible. We certainly cannot allow policy that treats them as though they're disposable, and especially when it comes to our children. COVID-19 pandemic put a spotlight, for instance, I know in America, on the nation's poor and low wealth workers. It put a spotlight, it laid bare, it exposed two great fissures of our society, systemic racism and systemic poverty. It exposed them. It did not create them. It exposed them. It worsened them, and it exposed them. It showed what we were and how for too long the nation had neglected the very people we ended up calling essential, but even much of the church had neglected. There was a Pew study that was done a few years ago examining 50,000 sermons and what was being taught to the people from the pulpit. And when the computer kicked it out, the word poverty, the word justice didn't even register as 1% of the sermon that people were hearing. Didn't even register. The issue of truth, the issue of the woe unto those who legislate evil, rob the poor, scriptures like that. The more than 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that speak to the issue of how we treat the least of these did not even register as things that were preached about and taught from the pulpit in the American pulpit. Even though when that study was done, already before COVID, and we did a study on this called The Souls of Poor Folk in 2018, and we update it every year. 43% of Americans were poor and low wealth. That is less than $500 away from economic disaster. And 52% of the children in the nation, 39 million children. 41% of our elders, 21 million. 42% of men, 65 million. 45% of women, 74 million. 60% of Black people, 26 million. 64% of Latinx people, 38 million. 48% of Asian people, 8 million. 58% of our indigenous brothers and sisters, poor and low wealth. Before COVID ever hit, 33% of white people, 6 million people were poor and low wealth before COVID ever hit. 40 million more white people in raw numbers than Black people. And yet among Black people, 60.9% of Black people are poor and low wealth. Before COVID ever hit, there were 62 million workers who made less than a living wage, and many of them are families, have children. Before COVID ever hit, 53% of all Black workers, most with families, made less than a living wage, a living wage of just $15 an hour, which was asked for in 1963 at the March on Washington. And in reality, should be over $20 an hour today. Think about that. It took African Americans, for instance, 400 years to get from nothing to $7.25 an hour. If you think about slavery, that's zero. And now the minimum wage in our country is $7.25. It has not been increased for 12 years. And yet we still do not pay a living wage before COVID. The Mailman School of Public Health noted before COVID, 250,000 people were dying a year from poverty. Over 700 people a day were dying from poverty before COVID. There's a debt, and they did a look at the denial of healthcare, denial of living wages, and found that in every one of those things, there's a death element. They're not benign. People literally died from government policies. Woe unto those who legislate evil, rob the poor and women of their rights, and make women and children pray, P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y. Policies that make people pray. Policies that become carnivores of people's lives, and the church must challenge that. In fact, in America, in the 13 most southern states, with 52 million people are poor and low income, 24 million white, 28 million people of color, 13 million people are totally uninsured. This is the South, where the civil rights movement was born. And the number of poor people in those 13 states make up more than 1/3 of all the poor people in the country, and the highest level of children in poverty. I was putting this together, thinking about your question, what's going on with children in the midst of this. Now, when COVID hits, we already had all of this economic stress, but we had parents of children who they were not paid enough to build up savings to tide them over in an emergency. They lacked paid medical leave and health insurance. They lacked access to unemployment insurance. They lived in expensive but overcrowded accommodations, and they already could not take care of their children. They were the first to be forced to go to work. We call them essential workers, but did not change policies, so many of them were treated as expendable. They were the first to go to work, first to get sick, first to spread it to their children, first to die, and the last to get the vaccine. And we still do not know. Your question to me about children, here's the thing, and why we have to have this kind of discernment that was talked about earlier and deep dive. We do not know yet the true public health impacts of COVID on the 140 million people alone in America and on children. What we do know is that poor and low income households are more vulnerable to the economic impacts of the pandemic. What we do know is when we did pass a child tax credit for a minute, 90% of low income houses spent their child income tax credit on food and housing and utility payments and clothes and education, even though there's some politicians now trying to say they spend it on having a good time. What we do know is that in America, for at least, all of the pandemic era programs like child income tax credit and earned income tax credits that benefited poor and low income people, and for a minute lifted some people out of poverty for a few months, are gone. They're over. So we found out that policy can actually address poverty, and now the policies are gone. We know that if we had kept expanding the child tax credit, 35 million households would have been lifted. We know that the child income tax credit benefited 4.7 million children. 1.7 million are white, and 960,000 were Black, and 1.7 million were Latino, and 200,000 were Asian, but it's gone, it's gone. We know that expanding the earned income tax credit benefited 17 million low-wage workers without children. This includes 10.3 million low-wage workers, 2.8 million low-wage Black workers, 10 million white workers. And we know it also benefited many families with children. We know that if we could have passed something as simple as the Build Back Better plan, and we challenged as not being enough, and we believe the church should be challenging as not being enough, but it was a start. We know that it would have provided universal pre-care for 3-4-year-olds, 6 million of them. That did not happen. We know, however, that in this pandemic, since it started in America alone, the billionaires made $2 trillion, and trillions of dollars were given to profit-driven entities without any restrictions. But every conversation about the poor is how can we means test it? How can we make sure they're not gaming the system? And the church must challenge this. Lastly, we know that what we are seeing are immoral choices that people are forced to make that are robbing the poor of their rights and making children and women and children pray. What we know, an estimated 5.2 million children worldwide have lost a parent or a caregiver to COVID-19. What we know in the United States, more than 167,000 children under 18 have lost a parent or a caregiver. The church cannot be silent on these matters, nor can we stutter, nor can we be affable on these matters. As Zora Neale Hurston once said, if folk hurt you and you don't say anything, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. That's a poet from the Harlem Renaissance. We know that Black and Hispanic children were 2 times more likely, and indigenous children were 4 times more likely to lose a parent in the midst of COVID. We know that deaths have disproportionately impacted poor children, and particularly the children of people of color. We know that there are huge impacts on schools that have been underfunded and neglected for decades. And so when COVID hit, the schools were not prepared. They already weren't dealing with the current realities before COVID. We didn't have enough resources to keep children, teachers, and staff. And lastly, we know that even as people are talking about lifting a mask mandate, one thing that's cruel about that is we want to rush to so-called get back to normal. But children under 5 in some places are not eligible to be vaccinated. Therefore, they are among the unvaccinated. And therefore, when you do the mask lifting, you put children at more risk. And here is the thing the church must know. None of this harm has to exist. And we cannot be silent anymore. We cannot just talk in our forums. We have to have a response even in the street. That's why in America on June 18th of 2022, we're calling for a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and beyond to do 3 things: reset the moral narrative by putting a face on the pain, making people see the children and the parent, not creating something where people can speak on behalf of others, but where they, the greatest moral authorities in the world, poor and low-wealth people, can speak. Number 2, to build power among poor and low-wealth people. And number 3, to place before the nation a redemption agenda, a reconstruction agenda, an agenda that literally says it's not about begging folk to do right by the poor, that countries in the world cannot survive themselves if we don't address the issue of poverty around this country and how violent it is and how destructive it is. And it doesn't have to be this way. And so we've got to decide to save the future of the world. And the truth of the matter, as the scriptures say, the stones that the builders have rejected, the poor, those who are hurting, low wealth, the stones that the builders have rejected have now become the chief cornerstone. It is the only possibility of building a world, building democracies, building nations that can sustain the tension. It is to address 5 issues: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of healthcare, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And the church was born and built 4 times like these. We must engage now. For Jesus' first sermon was not the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to have a seminar. Not the Spirit of the Lord was upon me just to teach people how to have a private relationship with God. The Spirit of the Lord was upon me to preach good news to the poor. And in Greek, that word is patokos, P-T-C-H-O-S, which means those who have been made poor by what Jürgen Moltmann called violent public policy and economic exploitation. It is the calling of Jesus and the calling of the prophets, and that for us to engage. And even if the world does not listen, Ezekiel said that God told him, I'm sending you to a world and a nation that is stiff-necked. And they may not hear you, but at least they will know that hath been a prophet among them. That is where we are. And what we will probably find is the same thing Ezekiel found, is that the answer, the moral authority, is in the valley of dry bones. And if we dare to speak to and lift up the poor and low wealth of this world, they actually can help this world move out of the nightmarish realities that we exist, see existing, and push us to a better day. Amos said last in Amos chapter 5, he said, God told Amos in the midst of a time of deep injustice, I need you to call a meeting. And the meeting needs to be the remnant. And I need the remnant of people to wail and cry like something is wrong. I need them to shut down everything, go into the streets and cry and say, not on our watch, not now, not us. And then the text says that God said to Amos, when I see this meeting, when I see the prophets and the impacted people wailing and lamenting and forcing the world to see it's wrong, then I will make my visit. That's what God literally says, then I will make my visit. That text actually comes before let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It is the call for a meeting of conscience, an assembly of the righteous, an assembly of love, assembly of truth. And it must be led with the church standing with poor people, not for them, not over them, but with poor and low wealth people. Because none of this has to be. And at every point, we must ask the question of the African proverb, how are the children? I don't care whatever else is happening. If the children are dying, and the children are sick, and the children are hurting, then we have a problem, and the beloved community has not come. Let us join together. Let us hear the call of Jesus, and let us hear the call and responsibility of the church. We cannot stand idly by while people are legislating evil, even in the midst of the pandemic, and making women and children pray, P-R-E-Y, and robbing the poor of their right. The poor have a right to life, love, justice, uplift, housing, living wages, health care, human rights, and the church must be at the forefront of addressing morality and moral public policy by creating and engaging in a moral movement that does not just stay limited to the pulpit, but even is willing to stand in the street with the people in order for the redemption of the very soul of the nation and the world. God bless you, and thank you so very much.